Hey, this is Annika. So a few weeks ago, I recorded an interview, which was about my journey into identifying as transgender, and then de-identifying as transgender, and a little bit to my surprise, we went even deeper into my story and talked not just about the gender identity stuff, but also what it was like living with a partner who was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities, and how being really close to this person and a caregiver for this person and coming in contact with not only their victim parts and their really vulnerable, traumatized parts, but also their abuser parts, the internalized abuser perpetrator parts, and how that resulted in my own mind fracturing, so that I started to experiencing myself as multiple, and I started switching between different parts of the self, which I had never done before. That was like a temporary new experience. And I have since spoken to several other people who were partnered with somebody with D.I.D. who also experienced a temporary fracturing of the self in response to their partner's internal multiple D.I.D. Identity system. So there was one comment on that video that I have been thinking about a lot, and I wanted to respond to more fully than just writing a comment back. And it was someone saying that they themselves had D.I.D. and that people with D.I.D. are typically victims and not perpetrators, and that a D.I.D. system in which there are violent or dangerous parts is extremely rare and not something that should be really talked about, because it's harmful to people with D.I.D. And the D.I.D. community. And I had an instant stress response to that comment, because that wasn't new. Like, this is not the first time I heard it. In fact, I used to say that. I used to say that about my partner, who ultimately ended up having an identity, a personality part that did plan to kill me. But until I met that part, I was one of the people telling everyone the very same thing. Like, D.I.D. is a response to severe trauma, which it is. Whoops, I'm stepping on the branch that my camera is attached to. Distracting myself. This is really vulnerable to talk about, and it's I could just feel even just talking about the response I had to that comment is kind of evoking a similar response again. So I'm starting to feel like a flutteriness and a nervous system activation. Whew. Okay. Oh, yeah, this is really uncomfortable. So I eventually, just very recently, actually, came to think of that idea as D.I.D. ideology. I was taught that. I was taught that by therapists. I was taught that by the books I was reading. I was taught that in the support groups that I joined that were meant to be for family members, loved ones of people with D.I.D. But there were people with D.I.D. in the support group as well. And they were the ones who kept repeating that like a mantra. Like, it was like a mantra. This, like, D.I.D. is about It's about people who are victimized. They're not the perpetrators, and that idea really majorly contributed to the undermining of my boundaries, because I ended up using that ideology as a way to gaslight myself. So whenever I did come across something that felt really manipulative and controlling, I could just hear that voice in my head. I'm like, oh, it's just part of the trauma. It's just the trauma. It's just the trauma. And then I invalidated my experience of being abused. And especially, that's why it was especially effective for my former partner to use weaponized vulnerability. So they would go to, if they had, like, say I set a boundary, they crossed my boundary, and then I expressed some dismay over having my boundary crossed, they would switch to a child part. And then all of a sudden I was dealing with, the consciousness, the awareness, the mindset of like a 5-year-old in distress. And so it triggered a maternal instinct in me. Because I was with child energy. It doesn't matter that the body was 40 years old. The personality, the energy, the identity that I was confronted with, the consciousness, was that of a child. And so I snapped into caring mother mode in response to the distressed 5-year-old persona that I was getting. And by the time we ended up moving through the trauma and the distress and the emotions and all of the things of this alter, by the time my partner switched back to an adult alter, I was exhausted, and I pretty much forgot about the original crossing of my boundaries. And so I constantly suppressed my own impact. I constantly forgot how I was being impacted. Every time I tried to bring it up, their own drama, and it was real. So, and I know this is I am speaking to this in terms of a control mechanism and a defense mechanism, and it is manipulative, but it wasn't fake. So the trauma that I was confronted with in my ex was not fake trauma. So they weren't faking it. Just the timing. It was the timing that was manipulative and controlling. They could have switched to that child part at a time when I was really resourced and grounded and willing and able to hold space for that coming up, right? That's different. But they would do it the moment they realized that they had somehow impacted me in a negative way, and I wanted to be heard in it. So I want to make that really, really clear. They didn't fake their trauma. The vulnerable parts really were vulnerable. It's just the fact that they got pushed to the front of the system in order to interact with me at that exact moment when I was hurt, so that I would then care for them instead of them having to take responsibility or face what they had done. And so that is a mechanism that I experienced over and over and over again. And I actually believe that this ideology, this idea of, people with D.I.D are the ones who are the vulnerable ones and the ones who are traumatized, is there to hide that mechanism. And I'm not saying this, my intention is not to demonize, stigmatize, shame, or somehow, attack people with D.I.D, but actually to help. Because if someone wants to support a person with D.I.D, they have to be able to see all of that person. They have to be able to be real, right? We have to, there's no healing to be had in a delusion. We have to come from a place of reality. And the hiding of that mechanism behind this ideology, behind this story, distorts reality. And within that distortion of reality, no healing is possible. And so this is not to add a stigma, but to be real, and then to destigmatize what's there. So stigma, I actually just looked this up because I kept hearing that, like, oh, you're stigmatizing mental illness, or we need to destigmatize D.I.D, and you're adding to the stigma of D.I.D. So I looked up what destigmatize actually means, and it means to add shame to like shame or derision, or like see in like a condemning or negative light. And that's not my intention. It is more negative. Like it does make a person with D.I.D look more dangerous, but that's real. And I don't think that people with D.I.D deserve any less love or care. But if we're not allowed to see the danger, like the real danger, then we can't protect ourselves. And if we can't protect ourselves, then we can't authentically help. So yes, it does paint a more dangerous person in a person with D.I.D, and I think that's realistic. However, I don't think that makes a person with D.I.D any less lovable, any less deserving of love. It does mean that whoever is going to be close to somebody with D.I.D is going to need a lot of awareness and a lot of support and a lot of resources in order to recognize and protect themselves from that mechanism of control. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but I think I'll leave it here for now. So D.I.D ideology. There's a lot more I want to say about this, but I'll leave it here. I said that once before. I'm going to say it again, and I'll come back to it another time. Thanks for checking in.